The blade didn't cut deep enough the first time. The bio-sheath on his forearm was tough, hardened by months of exposure to corrosive fog, and his hands were shaking too badly to hold the knife steady. Not from fear. Fear was a luxury for people who had eaten in the last 48 hours. Kael was shaking because his blood sugar had bottomed out, leaving him with a hollow, scraping sensation in his gut that felt like swallowing broken glass. He grit his teeth, the enamel grinding audibly in the suffocating silence of the cockpit, and pressed the jagged edge of the alloy scrap harder against his skin. This time, the skin parted. Blood welled up, dark and thick, looking almost black in the low light of the violet bioluminescence. It didn't drip immediately. It pooled, hesitant, as if his own body wanted to hoard every last drop of moisture in this desiccated graveyard of a world. But Kael forced his arm down, slamming the open wound against the pulsing, ribbed membrane of the wall. The reaction was instant. The ship didn't just power on, it inhaled. A wet, rattling gasp that vibrated through the floor plates and traveled up through the soles of his boots, seizing the muscles in his legs. The walls convulsed. The air pressure dropped, popping his ears with a sharp, stinging pain. He should have run. Any sane scavenger would have been halfway back to the maglev tracks by now, scrambling away from the sleeping giant they had just poked. But before the blood and the vibration and the terrifying realization that the ship was tasting him, there was the silence of the mud. 16 hours earlier, Xylos 9 had been doing its best to kill him, just as it did every day. The planet was less a world and more a galactic landfill, a sphere of rust and regret spinning in the dark. The surface was a slurry of shattered hull plating and half-digested war machines, all sinking slowly into black tar pits that bubbled with residual radiation. The air was thick with a metallic fog that tasted of burnt copper and coated everything in a greasy, conductive film. It was a place where civilizations went to rot. Kael trudged through the sludge, his breathing ragged behind the cracked faceplate of his rebreather. Every step was a battle against the suction of the ground. The viscous mud clung to his boots like clotting blood, trying to drag him down into the subterranean layers of trash where the radiation levels would cook his organs in an hour. He was gaunt, his exosuit hanging off his frame like loose skin on a skeleton. The suit was a patchwork disaster of scavenged parts, a hydraulic knee joint from a mining droid here, a chest plate from a dead Marine, there held together by industrial staples and prayer. He hadn't eaten in 3 days. The hunger had moved past pain and settled into a dull, rhythmic thumping behind his eyes. His left arm was wrapped in frayed bio-bandages that leaked faint green pus, the result of a slip on a jagged piece of reactor shielding 2 days ago. It throbbed in time with his heartbeat, a constant reminder of his own fragility. He needed a score, a big one. His last haul, a cracked fusion coil that would have bought him a week's worth of protein paste and maybe a shot of antibiotics, had been gone when he woke up. Stolen. He knew who did it. Jax and his crew of bottom feeders, but knowing didn't put food in his stomach. It just added fuel to the cold, hard knot of rage sitting where his digestion used to be. He had pushed further out into the wastes than anyone else dared, past the shallow graves where the casual scavengers picked over bones that had been stripped clean decades ago. He was looking for the deep wrecks, the ones buried under glaciers of frozen coolant and centuries of shifting trash. He found the dreadnought carcass jutting out of a hillside of compacted refuse like a broken rib. It was massive, a cathedral of war from an era when ships were built to intimidate stars. Kael didn't care about the history. He cared about the salvage. He spent hours swinging his pickaxe, the repetitive motion turning his shoulders into screaming knots of lactic acid. Clang, clang, clang. The sound was swallowed instantly by the fog. Then the rhythm broke. His pickaxe didn't ring against metal. It thudded, a dull, wet impact that sent a jolt of recoil up his arms, nearly dislocating his wrists. Kael froze. He pulled the tool back. There was no spark, no dent in a rusted plate. Instead, the surface he had struck seemed to recoil, rippling outward like a stone dropped in a pond. He leaned in, wiping the grime from his faceplate. He tore away layers of slag and petrified polymer shroud, his fingers scrabbling frantically. Beneath the industrial shell, the hull wasn't steel. It was organic, a massive, ribbed membrane covered in weeping pores and bioluminescent veins that glowed a faint, sickly violet. It was warm to the touch. Kael pulled his hand back as if he'd touched a hot stove. The warmth seeped through his glove, unnatural and disturbing in the freezing chill of the planet's surface. "Rotgut," a voice crackled over the open comms channel. Kael spun around, his hand dropping to the jagged pry bar at his hip. 3 figures emerged from the fog, their exosuits bulky and menacing. Jax. Of course, the scavenger leader stood on a ridge of trash, looking down at Kael with the disdain a butcher holds for a stray dog. "You came all this way for Rotgut, Kael?" Jax laughed, the sound distorted by static. "That ain't ship, that's a corpse worm. Biological waste, probably from the Bi-Gen Wars. It's warm," Kael rasped, his voice rough from disuse. "Yeah? So is a fresh pile of dung," one of Jax's lackeys sneered. "Cut it open, you'll find nothing but acid and gas. That thing ain't worth the credits to haul it." "Leave it," Jax commanded, turning his back. "Let the acid worms have it." "And him. He looks like he's about ready to drop anyway." They laughed again, a harsh metallic sound that grated against Kael's nerves. They turned and trudged back into the fog, leaving him alone with the pulsating wall. Kael watched them go. He should have followed. He should have begged for a scrap or tried to ambush them for his coil back. But he couldn't move. He stared at the violet veins pulsing beneath the translucent skin of the ship. He thought of his sister. The memory hit him like a physical blow to the chest, winding him. He saw her kneeling in the dust, the purification squad officer towering over her. Unworthy flesh must be cleansed. The officer's voice had been so calm, so sure. They had burned her because she had a genetic defect, a slight deviation in her ocular nerve. Imperfection was a crime. Kael looked at his own hands. Dirty, scarred, broken. He was imperfection personified. He was the refuse the galaxy threw away. And so was this ship. He didn't believe in destiny. He believed in the cold math of survival, and the math said he was dead. He had 0 credits, 0 food, and a festering arm. He looked at the ship again. It wasn't dead. It was waiting. A strange compulsion took hold of him. It wasn't a voice in his head, but a pressure in his skull, a magnetic pull that made his teeth ache. The ship was hungry. He could feel it radiating a starvation that matched his own. With trembling hands, he reached for the alloy scrap on his belt. He ignored the retreating signals of Jax's crew. He ignored the warning alarms in his suit, telling him his oxygen was low. He sliced open his forearm. The memory of the cut brought him back to the present, to the dark cockpit that smelled of ozone and old blood. The blood on his arm was flowing freely now, hot and crimson. He pressed it against the pulsing node. If you're hungry, Kael thought, his vision blurring at the edges as the adrenaline dumped into his system. I've got nothing left but rage. The membrane didn't just drink the blood, it fused with the wound. Small, thread-like tendrils erupted from the hull, lashing out and burrowing into the open meat of his arm. Kael screamed, a raw, guttural sound that tore his throat, but he didn't pull away. He couldn't. A low, wet groan echoed from deep within the wreck like a whale dreaming in its grave. The floor beneath him shifted, tilting as the leviathan began to stir from a slumber that had lasted centuries. The ground outside began to tremble, shaking the mountains of trash loose. Kael fell to his knees, his arms still fused to the wall, his blood acting as the ignition key for an engine made of meat and malice. The hull didn't stop at his arm. It pulled. The membrane rippled, turning from a solid wall into a semi-permeable sphincter that swallowed his hand, then his elbow, then his shoulder. Kael scrambled for purchase, his boots slipping on the slick, vibrating floor plates, but the ship was stronger. With a wet, sucking sound that popped the cartilage in his shoulder, he was yanked forward, tumbling through the membrane and into the gullet of the beast. He hit the floor hard. It yielded like wet peat. Kael gasped, ripping his rebreather off as he scrambled backward. The air inside wasn't metallic fog. It was hot, humid, and smelled violently of ozone and copper, the scent of a slaughterhouse sterilized by lightning. He looked up, his chest heaving, his vision swimming with gray spots. This wasn't a cockpit. There were no flight sticks, no holographic displays, no padded chairs. It was a cavity. The walls pulsed like intestinal lining, coated in a thick, translucent mucus that dripped slowly onto the deck. Bioluminescent tendrils dangled from the ceiling like exposed nerves, twitching toward him, tasting his body heat. The only light came from the rhythmic violet contraction of the walls, simulating a heartbeat so loud it rattled Kael's teeth. "Get up," he hissed to himself, his voice sounding small and flat in the wet chamber. He tried to stand, but his legs refused. A numbing cold spread from his gut outward, locking his muscles. The ship had injected him. The tendrils descended. They didn't strike like snakes. They drifted down like seaweed in a current, wrapping gently around his throat, his chest, his thighs. Then they tightened. The pressure was immediate and crushing. Kael clawed at his neck, his fingernails tearing at the slick, fibrous cords, but they were steel hard. The ship wasn't welcoming a pilot. It was digesting a parasite. Pain exploded in his skull, white-hot and blinding. It wasn't physical. It was neural. The leviathan was forcing its way into his mind, tearing through his chaotic surface thoughts to get to the stem. It judged him. It felt the weakness of his malnutrition, the rot in his arm, the hollowness of his gut. It found him wanting, unworthy. The word wasn't spoken. It was vomited into his brain. Then came the hallucinations. The violet light of the chamber shifted to the blinding white of a sterilization field. Kael wasn't on the ship anymore. He was back in the dust of Sector 4, his knees grinding into the gravel. The heat of the incinerators washed over him, singing his eyebrows. "Look at her," the voice of the High Inquisitor whispered. Kael squeezed his eyes shut, but the image burned through his eyelids. His sister, kneeling. The flamer unit leveled at her chest. She wasn't crying. She was looking at him. "Why didn't you save me, Kael? You're weak. You're trash." The flames erupted. "No!" Kael screamed, his voice a broken croak against the stranglehold of the vines. The ship amplified the memory. It replayed the sound of her skin cracking, the smell of burning hair, the silence that followed. It wanted to break him. It wanted to grind his ego into dust so it could consume the biomass that remained. The vines tightened further. His vision went black. His lungs burned, starving for oxygen. He was going to die here. Just another piece of calcified waste in the planet's gut. Good. A dark lizard brain instinct whispered. Let it end. But as the darkness closed in, something else snagged in his chest. A jagged hook of pure, unadulterated spite. It was the same spite that had kept him digging for 16 hours. The same spite that made him spit blood at the guards who broke his ribs. He stopped fighting the vines. He stopped trying to pull away. Instead, he pushed back. Not physically, he was a twig compared to the crushing strength of the organism, but mentally. He grabbed the memory of the fire, the screaming, the absolute humiliation of his existence, and he shoved it down the neural link. He didn't shield his mind. He opened the floodgates. "You think this hurts?" He projected his thoughts, screaming over the ship's rejection. "You think you can break what's already broken?" He forced the Leviathan to feel it all. The hunger that gnawed like a rat. The cold nights shivering under a sheet of plastic. The sound of Jax laughing. The look in Vela's eyes. The utter indifference of the powerful crushing the weak. "You want a soul," Kael rasped, blood bubbling past his lips. "Here's one forged in fire and failure. Choke on it." The constriction paused. The vines didn't loosen, but they stopped tightening. The ship hesitated. Its alien consciousness probed the wound in Kael's psyche. It expected fear. It expected a plea for mercy. It found neither. It found a mirror. Deep in the ship's mycelial core, something ancient and dormant stirred. It recognized the taste. It wasn't the clean, disciplined will of a soldier. It was the feral, desperate hunger of a predator that had been cornered. The leviathan had been hunted too. It had been shot down, buried, and left to rot in the dark. It knew this rage. The violet light in the chamber flared, turning deep in obsidian. The vines released his throat, only to strike harder, plunging directly into his spine. Kael arched his back, a silent scream frozen on his face as the neural interface fused with his nervous system. It wasn't a gentle sink, it was a hostile takeover that morphed into a union. He felt the ship's sensors expand his consciousness. He wasn't just Kael anymore, he was the hull buried in the mud. He was the dormant engines craving fuel. He was the weapon, pods aching to open. His eyes snapped open. The irises were gone, replaced by pools of shifting Vanta-black fluid. Violet veins spider-webbed across his face, glowing beneath the skin. The floor beneath him rippled and rose. The biological matter reshaped itself, bones cracking and reknitting in seconds. A structure formed behind him, not a chair but a cage of fused vertebrae and hardened cartilage. It wrapped around his torso, locking him in. Kael gripped the nodes that sprouted from the armrests. They were warm. They throbbed in time with his own heart. Hunger, the ship whispered. This time, it wasn't a rejection. It was a request. Yeah, Kael answered, his voice layering with a resonant metallic growl that wasn't his own. We eat. Outside, the mountain of trash exploded. The scavenger crews nearby, Jax and his men, still laughing about the corpse worm, stopped dead. The ground beneath them liquefied. The Leviathan rose. It didn't lift off like a standard frigate. It erupted. A shockwave of dirt and rusted metal blasted outward, knocking the scavengers flat. From the cloud of debris, a shape emerged that defied sanity. It was skeletal and terrifying. A mix of lobster-like carapace and industrial machinery. Bioluminescence flared from stem to stern, violet lightning crackling across the armored plates that slid into place with wet, heavy clicks, sealing the soft meat of the hull. The engines roared, not the high-pitched whine of plasma drives, but the guttural, thunderous boom of organic combustion. Methane sacs ignited. Muscle fibers the size of redwoods contracted like pistons. The ship screamed, a sound of twisting metal and waking fury that shattered the glass in Jax's helmet. On the newly formed bridge, Kael sat on his throne of bone. He didn't look at the displays. He didn't need to. He could feel the 3 purification cruisers breaking atmosphere in the upper quadrant. He could feel their targeting scanners locking onto his heat signature. He smiled, and the ship's external sensory arrays flared in unison. Rehunt. The clouds above the trash heaps didn't part. They were sliced open. 3 white streaks pierced the atmospheric smog, descending with the terrifying grace of surgical needles. The purification cruisers were beautiful in a way that made Kael's teeth ache, flawless, sterile porcelain hulls that gleamed with antifungal coatings. They didn't hum. They sang, a broadcast of harmonic frequencies designed to jam low-tech comms and pacify riot crowds. Kael felt them before he saw them. The Leviathan's sensory nodes picked up the vibration of their engines, a clean, magnetic purr that grated against the chaotic thrum of his own organic reactor. A holographic projection slashed into the air above the bone throne, overriding the ship's internal darkness. High Inquisitor Vela. She was exactly as he remembered, though he had only seen her once from the dirt, looking up. Pale skin, bald head, robes of woven silver that cost more than the entire GDP of Xylos 9. She looked at the scanner feed, at the biological nightmare rising from the mud, and her lip curled. Scavenger filth, she said. Her voice was calm, clinical, the tone of a doctor diagnosing a tumor. You cling to decay like a maggot to rot. Surrender your anomaly. Your existence offends cosmic order. Behind her, orbital data scrolled. They weren't just here for him. They had marked Xylos 9 for sterilization. Total incineration. 6 hours until the crust was glass. Kael didn't answer immediately. He stared at the woman who had ordered the fire that turned his sister to ash. He waited for the rage to blind him, for the adrenaline to shake his hands, but there was no shaking. His hands were fused to the neural yoke, the flesh merging with the biosteel. There was only a cold, hydraulic pressure in his chest. "You call this decay?" Kael whispered. The ship amplified it, turning his rasp into a subsonic boom that rattled the hull plates of Vela's cruiser. Good, because decay feeds what comes next. He cut the feed. Open wide, he thought. The Leviathan didn't fire lasers. It didn't launch missiles. The armored slats along its flanks retracted with a sound like breaking ribs, revealing rows of weeping pores. The ship spat. A swarm of bioharpoons, calcified spines the size of telephone poles, launched from the lateral maws. They didn't travel in a straight line. They writhed through the air, correcting their trajectory with twitching fins. The lead cruiser's shields flared blue, expecting energy fire. The harpoons ignored the energy displacement, punching through the barrier with kinetic mass and burying themselves deep into the white hull. Germinate. Kael sent the command through the link. The harpoons exploded, not with fire, but with life. Vines of black mycelium erupted from the impact points, tearing through bulkheads and durasteel as if they were wet cardboard. The pristine white ship turned black in seconds, a galloping necrosis spreading across its skin. On the bridge of the lead cruiser, the crew didn't have time to scream. The fungal roots sought heat. They burst from the ventilation shafts, wrapping around ankles and throats. They erupted from the mouths of the navigation officers, converting flesh into biomass instantly. The ship bloomed. It cracked open like a seed pod, releasing a cloud of spore mines that drifted into the path of the second vessel. The second cruiser tried to evade, banking hard. The spores made contact. Detonation. The shields collapsed under the chemical assault, dissolving the hull plating into gray sludge. The ship depressurized, venting atmosphere and bodies into the metallic fog. 2 down. Vela's flagship, the Purity, began to backpedal. Her engines flared bright blue, desperate to put distance between herself and the abomination. "She's running," the Leviathan growled in Kael's mind. It sounded amused. "No," Kael said. He leaned back into the wet embrace of the throne. "She's just leading us to the throat." He gripped the yoke. The Leviathan shunted power from the armor to the warp tendrils. The world outside smeared. They didn't enter hyperspace. They folded the distance, stepping through the shadow of the dimension. They reappeared instantly, latched onto the stern of the Purity like a tick on a wolf. The impact threw Kael forward against the restraints. The Leviathan's mandibles clamped onto the enemy engines, crushing the thrusters. Kael could feel the vibration of the enemy ship through his own bones. He could feel their panic. He didn't fire. He just drained. The bioship siphoned the energy from the cruiser's reactor, drinking the plasma to fuel its own regeneration. The Purity went dark. Gravity failed. Life support failed. Kael opened a channel one last time. Vela was on the floor of her bridge, bathed in the emergency red light. Her composure was gone. She looked small. Mortal. This is abomination. She shrieked, clutching her silver robes. "No," Kael said, watching the mycelium begin to crack the glass of her viewport. "This is evolution." The Leviathan constricted. The cruiser crumpled, imploding under the pressure of the organic coils. Metal screamed as it was compressed into a sphere of scrap. Vela's final transmission was a choked sob. "Mercy, I don't have that anymore," Kael said. The Leviathan swallowed the wreckage whole. Hours later, the silence returned to Xylos 9. But it wasn't the silence of the grave. It was the silence of a predator digesting a meal. Kael sat in the heart chamber. The loot was secured, the genome codex, a crystalline list of every unworthy soul the Empire had burned, and the sterilization beacons, now repurposed to seed life rather than end it. He broadcasted on all frequencies, his voice layered with the ship's guttural resonance, bouncing off satellites and relay stations across the sector. "To every empire that calls itself pure, I am the rot in your vaults. I am the fever in your blood. You buried the truth. Now come cleanse me. I'll wear your bones as armor." He cut the mic. The adrenaline faded. The battle high washed away, leaving him in the cold, wet dark of the cockpit. Kael tried to stand up. He wanted to walk to the viewport, to see the violet moss already spreading across the toxic sludge below, healing the world he had hated for so long. He tried to pull his arms from the armrests. They didn't move. Kael looked down. The fusion during the fight hadn't been temporary. The biosteel had grown over his wrists, past his elbows. The veins of the ship were now inextricably woven into his own. He pulled, panic flaring in his chest for the first time since the fight began. The flesh held fast. He wasn't a pilot in a suit. He was a component. The leviathan purred, a low, comforting vibration that traveled up his fused spine. "We are home," it whispered. Kael stopped struggling. He looked at his reflection in the dark, polished surface of a sensor node. His eyes were gone, replaced by solid orbs of obsidian. His skin was gray, veined with violet light. He had won. He had avenged his sister. He had the power to break empires, but he would never feel the wind on his skin again. He would never hold a loaf of bread, or shake a hand, or walk away from this chair. He was the warlord of the wastes. He was the savior of the broken. Kael closed his eyes and listened to the wet, rhythmic thumping of the ship's heart, indistinguishable from his own. The galaxy thought monsters were born in the dark. Kael knew the truth. They were made when you had to sell your humanity to survive it. "Yeah," Kael whispered to the empty room. "We're home."